Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody here in the room, and I understand we're into triple figures in terms of those online. Anyway, it's a huge pleasure to be here. Let me just start by introducing myself. My name is Mike Catchpole. I'm the chief scientist at one of the EU agencies, the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control in Stockholm. We are one of the so-called envy agencies, along with our with EFSA, who are the main hosts of this conference. And I'm here representing the session organizers drawn from each of the envy agencies. And so that's the ECDC, where I work. We've been busy with COVID. The Chemicals Agency, the Environment Agency, of course, the Food Safety Authority, and the European Medicines Agency. So the focus of this morning's session is very much on the science policy interface. The EU agencies have been created to support EU policies, and the EU agencies, the MB agencies, are very much science-based organizations. And so this theme is obviously of immediate relevance to ourselves. We need to recognize that we are in a rapidly evolving environment. Things happen fast. I mentioned COVID before. And in terms of EU agencies' roles in supporting policy, I would just use COVID as an example, that in 2020 alone, ECDC produced 110 scientific reports and outputs, risk assessments, guidance documents on COVID, drawing on the rapidly accumulating body of evidence, also involved in advising on research projects. So all the agencies are clearly involved in policy, but I think that there is room to strengthen that science policy interface, and I feel that agencies have a key role to play in that. So this morning we will learn what is already being done and how much expertise there is around in the EU agencies. But I think really the key thing that I hope we get from this session is that we get your suggestions, you the audience, your suggestions and input informed by the excellent speakers that we've got and the panels that we've got. We get your views and suggestions on what the agencies can or should do more of, individually or collectively. And I should mention that I mentioned the COVID, those scientific reports that ECDC was involved in producing. Many of those reports we actually produced collaboratively with other EU agencies. So looking at what we can do individually and collectively to support European research efforts, and I think we have a key role also in translation of research findings into action and policy. So today, the structure of today is we will have two halves to the session. We will start with some scene setting and a moderated panel discussion, giving you various perspectives from the agencies, from the policy side, from the research side. And we'll look at the particular role that agencies have at that crossroads of the science policy interface, and discuss current and envisaged research involvement. And we also present case studies showing the benefits of EU agency involvement in research, and from that formulate recommendations on how agencies can be even more involved in at that crossroads. And of course, the context for this is very much how can we strengthen that science policy interface to support decisions to keep food safe while it remains nutritious and becomes more sustainable. So during the course of the sessions, if you have questions for the speakers, the panel members, please can you make use of the app, the conference app, to register your questions. There will be no microphones passed around in this room, so even if you're in the room, if you do have a question, please use the app to post the question, and I and the speakers will see questions on a screen here on the stage. So, as I said, we've got some excellent speakers this morning. I'm really looking forward to listening to the talks. The scene setting, first of all, we will have three speakers. We'll have Dr. Bernhard Url, Dr. Karen Fabbri, and Dr. Robert van Gorcom. I will introduce each of them individually before they speak, but perhaps I could ask the three of you to come up and take a seat on the stage now. So, our first speaker this morning is Dr. Bernhard Url. He is the Executive Director of EFSA and has been so since June of 2014. And he joined EFSA, in fact, in 2012 as their head of their Risk Assessment and Scientific Assistance Department. He is a qualified veterinarian by training, and before coming to EFSA was the Managing Director of the Austrian Agency for Health and Food Safety. And Bernhard is going to talk on EU agencies as transdisciplinary agents of change. So Bernhard, please, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Mike, and a warm good morning also from my side. It's not the first good morning in this room, so you might get a bit bored already. So it's good that we are at the last but one day of the conference. And today I want to talk a little bit about the role of EU agencies as agents of change, which is an interesting task for us as agencies. And as Mike has said, it's not about EFSA, it's about a family of agencies that, as we report to the Environment Committee of the European Parliament, we call us the ENVI agencies. And this is, of course, to be seen in a setting of the changing world. Mike has made reference to that. And with regards to food, it's what we try to do as agencies is to broaden the discussion and to bring forward, when we see this science policy interface, how can we respond properly to the emergencies that we see when we look at the food system and the state of the planet? We know, there's no doubt anymore, that the way we produce, consume, waste food is depleting the resources of the planet. We cannot continue like that. It's not possible. We are operating outside the planetary boundaries, so we need change. We need knowledge for this change, and this knowledge has to be translated into policy actions. And that's why this interface between science, between research, between knowledge and policy is so important. The European Union has replied to that need with the European Green Deal, with initiatives on biodiversity and zero pollution, farm-to-fork strategies. So there is a big political ambition within the European Commission to answer to these problems. And we have seen the pandemic again has shown us that species jump from wildlife habitats to human habitats. They jump species. There's no, the species barriers are not working. So we also cannot continue to work in what I would say silo-ish approaches. And for that also research efforts have to be targeted in a way that value is produced not only for the research community, but also for the society at large, so to speak, for public health in our way. And we think that the EU agencies and also EFSA can be and should be part of the solution and not be part of the problem, so to speak. A short view on EFSA before coming to the EU agencies. Our task as EFSA is to provide scientific advice. And I think, in a way, by definition, scientific advice is a bridge between hypothesis-driven research and value-driven policy decisions. So we have research that is driven by hypotheses, and then we have policy making which is driven by values, by ideas how the society should look like in the future. And in between are we as agencies to translate, to make sense out of the knowledge produced by research and to advise policymakers so that they can make the best decisions for the future of the society. And as EFSA, over many years we have worked on the interface with the risk managers. So that was, so to speak, traditional, but we have realized that we have to invest more of our efforts also on the science side of this production chain. We have become more engaged in this external research environment, have organized what we have called the Risk Assessment Research Assembly 4 years ago, but was a first attempt to bring together funders, researchers, research organizations, and try to make a better fit between research and the needs of regulatory science. So if you allow me to look at this production chain from upstream to downstream, we try, and I think quite successfully in the last years, to influence upstream research agendas. So we advise the needs, we bring to the table the needs of regulatory research needs. We published Food Safety Regulatory Research Needs 2030, and by doing this upstream work, which I find very important, we can influence programs, we can influence calls, and by this we can increase the likelihood that the outcomes of research can be utilized by regulatory science. And midstream, if you allow me calling like that, midstream, it means being members of steering committees, being members of advisory boards to research programs and consortia. And there we try to make sure that answering the actual research hypothesis will deliver what we would call useful outcomes, useful also for regulatory science. And therefore we engage in several research projects like the One Health EGP, the Food Safety for You, and now recently and newly also EU partnerships like the Partnership for Chemical Risk Assessment, PARC. And downstream, when research is done, we often face a challenge. And I put this a bit boldly. We see that research consortia, they publish their results, they produce the deliverables, and then they move on. Research industries, grants, research, publications, we move on to the next project. And the transformation of the outcomes of their projects into process mode of regulatory science is not always working. It depends, for example, on the ways results are reported, the lack of common data standards, the lack of accessibility to raw data. And only recently we discussed with an EU research program about emerging risks, and they told us we will produce a database. And I think this is a good example of, okay, a database is produced, but what about the maintenance of a database after the project is closed? And there we really have gaps that are not useful in the way how we use taxpayers' money. And only yesterday we discussed with the US FDA about aspects of our collaboration, and the colleague from the US FDA said when they instigated the research on COVID vaccines, one of the requirements was actionable evidence. And I found this really a nice keyword, actionable evidence. That is what we also expect from research programs, on research projects. How can we utilize better the outcomes of research projects for regulatory science? We try to support this as EFSA with our limited means by establishing platforms, for example, and we will again convene a risk assessment research assembly this year, in December of this year, trying to stimulate synergies between agencies and EU and national research activities. So we want to bring together funders, researchers, regulatory agencies, risk managers, to create sort of a multi-stakeholder dialogue. It's all about increasing the impact for answering societal questions. So please, if you have time and want to come to Berlin, I cordially invite you for the 7th of December to join us in our risk assessment research assembly in Berlin this year. As agencies together, I think we can say we have developed well-established scientific networks with many stakeholders, and this offers a sustainable base for partnerships under the Horizon Europe program. So we are playing on the science policy interface, so to speak, using outcomes of our research projects, databases, models, and we integrate this in our risk assessments. We bring together the knowledge base which is created by science, and we make it in a format, we bring it in a format that's accessible to the public and to policymakers, and also to bring together scientists from different disciplines, which I think we have seen under this One Health approach is one of the key levers is this transdisciplinary working. But also the other way, policy to science, we provide access to networks. We, the agencies, I think one of our treasures of agencies is to have the networks with the member states. We can tap into the expertise of the member states and make this available also for policy decisions. And cross-agency cooperation is one of my favorite topics. It's really close to my heart. How can we as NV agencies collaborate more, deeper, better? Collaboration should be the default. And only if collaboration does not work, we should do it individually. Are we already there? Well, we have made progress. No, Mike, we have made progress. We do a lot together with ECDC. We do a lot together with ECHA. We do more and more also with the Environment Agency, with the Medicines Agency. So we are moving forward. Are we moving fast enough? Sometimes I tell to our people in EFSA, in Parma, in Italy, we are moving like a tartaruga, a turtle. A turtle is moving. But if the outside world is moving like a rabbit, the race is not a fair one, no? So we should move faster also in our collaboration. What my expectations are for this morning is I would like to witness this breadth of expertise and the resources we have already, and I would strongly welcome if this session would formulate recommendations, what we can do more and how we can bring these recommendations also to our final session tomorrow. Finally, and with this I want to conclude, I would like to share a suggestion also for your further consideration. It would be timely to also formulate research needs from a One Health perspective. I think it would be very useful. And the question is, could this be facilitated by establishing something like One Health research and innovation structures, governances, methodologies to also look at research from the One Health perspective, both at national and EU level. So with the aim, of course, to ensure a coordinated interaction across different sectors and to provide something like a common access point also for Commission services and national authorities. And it's an idea, and what could this mean in practice? We have to find out. So we as agencies are ready to support that. We want to be agents of change. We can do better, and I promise you, at least we will try to do better. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bernhard. A really good and stimulating start to the proceedings this morning. So our next speaker is Dr. Karen Fabbri. Karen is the Deputy Head of the Unit Bioeconomy and Food Systems Healthy Planet Directorate at DG Research and Innovation in the European Commission. She's got over 2 decades of work experience at the European Commission, particularly in positions focusing on the interface between science and policy, so is eminently well qualified to speak on this topic. She currently leads the Food 2030 work at the DG for Research and Innovation, where she's responsible for the development of EU research and innovation policy for sustainable, healthy, and inclusive food systems. So I can think of no better person to give a talk on strengthening science policy interface. Karen, please.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very thankful for the invitation to this One Health conference and honored to be on this outstanding panel. So the words of Bernhard were very inspirational. I fully agree with many of the things you've said, and that transdisciplinary approaches are needed, and we need to collaborate more. In particular, to consider all aspects that connect One Health approaches. And for that, we also need to further enhance our existing science policy interfaces in Europe and beyond. So policymaking is a process by which governments and European institutions translate their political vision into programs and actions to deliver outcomes for society. Good policymaking requires consulting, communicating, and engaging with stakeholders to collectively design, test, and deliver policy solutions. And Europe is well equipped with that, with its better regulation approach. Good policymaking also makes use of the most up-to-date science, knowledge, data, and evidence to envisage viable policy options which maximize benefits and minimize trade-offs. The institutional policy or science policy landscape in the European Commission is quite rich, including the work done by my own DG Research and Innovation, the DG's Joint Research Center, the SAM, the Strategic Advice Mechanism, and last but not least, the work of our excellent implementing and executing agencies. And all together, we form a flexible EC science policy landscape that organically adapts to the needs and challenges. In this respect, this conference is quite unique, and its sessions demonstrate the importance of cooperation between agencies and organizations gathered here today to discuss how to make a difference in bridging EU research, science, and innovation and policy to address the multiple and interconnected challenges of our times. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's here that I'm going to tell you the story of our high-level expert group, which was tasked to explore the needs, gaps, and options to strengthen the international science policy interface for sustainable food systems transformation. But why food systems? Because the issue is urgent, it's highly complex, it's relevant from local to global levels, and it affects and is affected by multiple policies. It's multi-sectoral, and really, it affects us all. Without fixing food systems, we can't fix climate, we can't fix our health, we can't fix our environment, and we cannot live in respect of our planetary boundaries. And now, more than ever, given the food crisis triggered by the invasion of Ukraine, it's time to act and move into fifth gear. Last year, 2021, was what I call a eureka moment, when the UN set up its first ever Food Systems Summit. Food systems actually became a thing and finally entered the political discourse. And the European Commission was very much involved in the process, which was actually quite focused on thematic issues through the various coalitions. But my team noticed that there was a gap. And so we made an attempt to fill it. And at that time, we asked ourselves questions like, what about the science policy interface? Is it fit for purpose? And well, for example, does the world need an IPCC for food systems? So to investigate this issue, we set up a high-level expert group which gathered 19 experts from around the world and who worked diligently together over an 18-month period. We met every Monday virtually with the leadership team and every 3 weeks with the expert groups. And everything happened under COVID, so it was fully a virtual process. But the culmination of this process is last Friday's publication of their final report entitled "Everyone at the Table: Transforming Food Systems by Connecting Science, Policy, and Society," that presents pathways and recommendations for more ambitious, fit-for-purpose, interlinked international science policy interfaces for improved food systems governance. Now, their findings are meant to inspire, inform, and feed further debate on next steps as a follow-up to the UN Food Systems Summit process. One of their key tasks was to build up the evidence base to subsequently underpin their findings and recommendations. So they mapped existing science policy interfaces, They established key principles and functions to assess them by, which led to the identification of different, what we called science policy interface landscapes. Now, based on these, the report sets out 3 recommended pathways, which are not exclusive, but rather to be seen as progressive and mutually supportive. The first pathway, number 1, sets out how to strengthen and adapt existing science policy interfaces using additional resources and under broadening mandates for engagement across sectors and across geographical scales. The second recommended pathway sets out how to enhance the current landscape via the establishment of multi-sectoral task forces to fill priority knowledge and data gaps. And the third recommended pathway sets out a vision to coordinate agendas by creating a network of networks or a global network coordination hub to build capacity, convene regional assessments, and develop forecasts and foresight and models to envision potential futures and identify trends. I will not say more because I don't want to spoil your reading experience, but instead I wish to cherry pick some selected messages from my personal perspective, which I hope can be inspirational in the context of your discussions today. Firstly, is that much good work is already being done by existing science policy interfaces. But to meet the magnitude and urgency of the changes required, we need to address some gaps. One of the first gaps is the existing fragmentation. There are many SPIs, but they focus on different parts of the food system at different levels, different scales. Some are ad hoc, some are time-bound, some are hardwired and institutionalized, and each science policy interface has its role. But determining impact is difficult. The landscape of SPIs lack a systems approach, needed to handle the complexity and urgency, and the need to deliver co-benefits while minimizing trade-offs. Such approaches require inter- and transdisciplinarity. But how do we weave this in deeper and better? We need to get better at integrating social sciences and humanities with natural sciences, engineering, and other fields to develop common languages, common visions, and a compass for change. Then there's a lack of clarity on how scientific knowledge and findings at global level can truly impact national and regional levels. Hence, we need a multi-scalar approach. Some people call it polycentric. In other words, how can science and knowledge at one level, say global, be used or adapted at another level, say local or national, to help develop policy options that are truly relevant to people on the ground? And to be a little bit more provocative even, do all member states in Europe have a fit-for-purpose science policy interface to ensure their strategies and action plans to transform food systems will be based on science and evidence so as to meet the high level of ambition needed to achieve our Green Deal and just transition goals? If yes, I can retire now. If not, well, how can we help? Food system transformation, and this is my last point, is predominantly a social issue. It's not just about technology. Technology isn't going to solve all our problems. So the concept of science policy interfaces needs to evolve into science policy society interfaces, where society is engaged in the process. In fact, the way in which society is involved in science policy processes needs a rethink to ensure the integration of diverse voices, local and experiential knowledge, including those of vulnerable and indigenous groups. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope this has helped provide some food for thought on how to further enhance synergies and cooperation between respective agencies to strengthen our science policy interfaces in the EU. I wish you a fruitful day and many insightful conversations on how we can move things forward together. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Karen. And I look forward, I must admit I haven't yet read the report, but I do look forward to reading it. So the last speaker in this morning's first session, the scene setting session, is Dr. Robert van Gorcom, who comes to us from he's a member of the European Court of Auditors. We're really grateful, Robert, for you coming with us to here. Robert will be, I'm sure, in part talking about a piece of work that Mr. Brenninkmeijer, a Dutch national who served as a member of the Court of Auditors, was very much involved with on the future of EU agencies. And we're really grateful to Robert to come to speak about that. So the title of Robert's, actually, sorry, I forgot to introduce Robert. I should say a few words about yourselves. So Robert is the General Director of the, I'm going to say this wrong, I know I am, Wageningen? Not even close, was it? Anyway, the food safety research body, which is not only an official laboratory for the Netherlands, but it's a major national reference laboratory, an EU reference laboratory, and is part of the University and Research Institute. He's a molecular biologist by background, and he has worked on applied molecular microbiology and plant biotechnology. And from 2014 to 2018, he was a member of the management board of EFSA. So Robert is really well placed, not only in terms of his knowledge of EFSA, his scientific background, but also his work with the Court of Auditors to talk on the topic of research collaboration across agencies and national stakeholders. Robert, please.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Well, as you just heard, I took over this slot from a very respected colleague who unfortunately passed away several weeks ago, Alex Brenninkmeijer. And I would like to, therefore, try to honor him by reading to you two key messages of his recent special audit on the impact of EU agencies, which he was going to present here today. The first quote is, "The cooperation between EU agencies needs to reach another level. So far, synergies have been thought primarily in horizontal administrative processes such as IT and HR. Policy coordination and cooperation is a more promising area, and EU agencies can share views and need to learn from their voice, to find their voice, sorry. Even agencies that do not seem to be very policy-driven can actively contribute to cooperation on policies such as the Green Deal and COVID recovery." And a second quote, "In short, policy cooperation is crucial to EU agencies' success and needs to be fostered by their institutional partners. As far as EU citizens are concerned, individual EU agencies only succeed if the policy as a whole succeeds." I must say I fully subscribe to his conclusion, and I would like to build further on it from my perspective as General Director of Wageningen Food Safety Research, suggesting that also inter-agency collaboration in the programming of research, which was already mentioned by Bernhard, is of great benefit. Let me explain this in more detail. This conference is a good example of the close relation that the 5 NV agencies enjoy. Although different in their main tasks, these agencies have many common topics and opportunities for collaboration. And this collaboration goes indeed far beyond the topics of joint procurement, joint IT or HR issues, or the relation with the DGs of the Commission and the European Parliament. This collaboration can be and should be also about the substance of their mission and tasks. For example, the general knowledge on a specific compound or chemical is essential for all agencies dealing with that compound. The difference between, for example, ECHA, EFSA, and EEA is sometimes only a matter of the concentration of the chemical. But for all, the knowledge about the compound is essential. And also, the mode and quantification of human exposure to compounds, pathogens or viruses, will be very relevant for ECHA, EMA, ECDC, and EFSA. So scientific collaboration between these ENVI agencies is very helpful and will bring many additional advantages. For all these EU agencies, independent, high-quality science is the foundation on which they give their evaluations, opinions, scientific advice, or assessments. So the quality and applicability of the scientific output is an important success factor for these agencies. And sometimes the lack of relevant or reproducible studies is also a limiting factor on the quality of their output. And since the Commission and national governments rely directly or indirectly on the output of these EU agencies to build their policy, their regulations, or their market admissions, the relevance of adequate and excellent science in the field essential for these agencies will be clear. And this is also reflected in the slogan of EFSA, trusted science for safe foods. But of course, the scientific questions, although often related, in many cases are slightly different from agency to agency. So joint programming of research will be very synergistic and, to my opinion, a win-win. And let me give you just 2 examples of specific research questions relevant for several ENVI agencies. For example, research on the mode of action of an antibiotic will be of relevance for EMA in its tasks in market admission, for ECDC, for example, on the effects in outbreaks and resistance issues, for EFSA, in risks in residues, or again, resistance issues, and for EEA, in risk for the microbiome in surface water or in soils. And secondly, the research on the degradation of PFAS will be of relevance for ECHA, for its working reach, for EEA, in relation to environmental risks, and for EFSA, in the risks in feed and food. And for regulatory science, science specifically needed for regulatory purposes, specific studies will be needed. For example, the study on the transfer of contaminants from feed to food, or the development of methods for the calculation of the intake of substances, the fate of human drugs in wastewater treatment, or synergistic effects of drugs, pesticides, or contaminants. And that's just to mention a few. But how do the agencies get the science they need? Most scientific science research is programmed by the EU and national funding programs. But the role of the EU agencies in the programming of EU framework programs has been relatively limited in the past. And fortunately, like Bernhard already said, that is changing, and it's really improving. However, it will be very important to align the needs of the different agencies and the EU Commission on the same compound, bug, or hazard to create synergy. And in addition, for several needs, the agencies also need their own funds to finance dedicated scientific studies. But there's also another aspect to consider, and that's capacity building. As in many other domains, networking and capacity building are crucial. So an additional important role of interagency science cooperation is to develop and maintain these networks of scientists. The EU agencies will recruit part of their future employees from these networks. As former member of the management board of EFSA, allow me to further zoom in on the European Food Safety Authority. The primary process of EFSA builds on its scientific committee and 10 scientific panels. Somewhere between 200 and 250 external scientists are selected by EFSA to serve in these panels. Its members come all from independent national scientific organizations, both academic and governmental. A relation with industry, with interest in the domain of EFSA, is not accepted for these panel members. The advantage of this model is that also at the national level, capacity stays intact to support the national government in its need for risk assessment and market admissions. The regulatory work, both EU and national, of these panel members is normally only part of their job. By also doing research themselves and publishing this work, they maintain their scientific profile in this domain and stay up to date. The maximum term of a panel member will become 2 periods of 5 years at EFSA. So a small calculation shows that Europe needs a substantial number of scientists in the EFSA domain to have enough capacity to play a role in the regulatory process of EFSA. Consequently, it's essential to continuously build this national capacity, and performing research is an excellent training. So funding of relevant research not only has the aim to build the scientific knowledge needed for the agencies, but it's also essential for building the future risk assessment capacity. And if these type of projects are programmed well, this capacity building also supports the inter- and transdisciplinarity and the networking mentioned by the previous speakers, and including the science policy interface. So in conclusion, collaboration between the ENVI agencies, also in the area of research, is essential. There's so much overlap in their essential knowledge domains that exchange of knowledge and expertise is a win-win. Trusted and reproducible science is crucial for the quality of the output of the agencies. There is substantial overlap in the scientific questions relevant for ECDC, ECHA, EEA, EFSA, and EMA. So joint programming will bring synergies. The regulatory science perspective of these agencies will not have been always top of mind of the scientific community, so a proper involvement in the programming of the EU framework RTD programs is important. And for more specific questions, the agencies also need their own research funds. But next to the scientific needs of the agencies, building the future generation of employees and members of the scientific panels is of utmost importance. We need to be ready for the future. Thank you very much.
Robert, thank you very much. Very stimulating. Excellent. We will be moving on in just a moment to a moderated panel discussion. As I say, if you have questions about any of the talks you've heard or points raised in the following panel, then please use the app to register those questions. I think it set the scene really well. I would just mention that I don't think anybody on this stage would disagree with the points you made about the value of the working together of the different agencies. And just for those in the audience that might not be so aware, I mean, the agencies do work together closely. And just to take one example, because you mentioned antimicrobials, is that ECDC and EFSA and EMA work together to produce a joint report on not only the antimicrobial resistance, but more broadly on the use, the consumption of antimicrobials in both the human and animal populations. And that's just one of many examples where the agencies work together. And I think also, just at that, because Karen mentioned the issue about, as did Bernhard, about interdisciplinarity, that there is a network of the sub-network of the so-called the chief scientists of the EU agencies that have such a function. And we meet a couple of times a year and we work together. And as a result of that, for example, ECDC is now in a collaborative project with Eurofund that look at health and well-being across Europe, looking at both the social impact as well as the health impacts of non-pharmaceutical interventions against COVID. I think it's a nice example of that interdisciplinarity. But what my personal hope is that the networks that Bernhard referred to, we sit at the sort of in the network hub of the networks, and it gives the agencies a tremendous insight into the real world priorities and challenges and scientific challenges for those that are dealing with practical regulatory issues, and I would make the point that the agencies do not have a particular vested interest in one research project or another. We're not competing for research accreditation as such, and I think that it's a powerful source of unbiased views on real-world scientific challenges for research funders at the EU level to tap into. Anyway, could I ask you all to thank our three speakers for excellent speeches, and can I personally thank you for all keeping to time so well. So we now move on to a moderated panel discussion. And this provides an opportunity to hear the perspectives from different stakeholders involved in the science policy interface. So we're going to be joined in just a moment by panelists who will speak from a policymaker's perspective, a researcher's perspective, and from an EU agency's perspective. And through the panel discussion, we hope that we'll get a better understanding of what currently hinders effective science policy interfaces, with a view to coming up with potential ideas on how to overcome these barriers. So with that, could I invite the three panel members, that's Zoe Dingwall, Catherine Gansleben, and Pekka Jokalainen, to join me here up on the stage. And I promise I won't say it again after this, but please remember to use the app if you have any questions. So, first of all, it's a real pleasure to invite Zoe Dingwall to give a brief intervention. And Zoe has worked for over 5 years as a policy advisor for the Greens EFA group in the European Parliament Committee for Environment, Public Health and Food Safety, the ENVI committee. She graduated from the University of Abertay in Dundee with an honours degree in law. Personal aside, I was just at St Andrews for my son's graduation last week. And she's worked on a range of cross-cutting issues, and was part of the European Parliament negotiating team for the Farm to Fork strategy and the recent revision of the Union Civil Protection Mechanism in the wake of the COVID pandemic. So, Zoe, it's really great to have you with us and to have your insights from that policy side. Zoe.
Thank you everyone. Well, certainly from what we've heard today, there's no doubt, certainly in my mind, that a transdisciplinary One Health agency really does have the potential to reduce the fragmentation that we see in the Parliament, certainly of these interlinked scientific specialisms. I think that we can agree that a multi-sectorial approach will help better support policy making, as well as strengthening inter-agency communication and cooperation. Complex issues such as climate change, zoonosis, and antimicrobial resistance require a multifaceted approach based on independent science, which also needs to consider the socio-economic factors such as the cost of living, poverty, and inequalities. And the reason I say that is food poverty is fundamental, and it tends to be judged as a symptom of poor household planning, which is essentially sort of victim blaming. But the reality is the inevitable consequence of inequality and inadequate support. And in some parts of Europe, we're actually seeing the re-emergence of Victorian diseases that are caused by poor diet and nutrition. So the transition towards a more sustainable food system and a carbon-neutral economy will only be achieved by addressing the poverty and inequalities for society as a whole. But most importantly, we must uphold transparency of decision-making and clarity really on who's influencing these decisions with strict rules and rules of interest, conflicts of interest. So, and we often hear about the need for independent scientists, but scientists, like the rest of us, cannot be stripped of their own personal values, beliefs, or interests in which they're heavily invested. So regulatory safeguards are needed to ensure that business as usual and financial interest is not prioritised over the public interest. Finally, I think it would be very useful if the ENVI agencies had a permanent seat to participate in the Council and Commission negotiations, just as a gentle reminder to policymakers of the overarching importance of the One Health approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that intervention, Zoe. So we're just going to run through the panel with some interventions. So next, I'd like to ask Dr. Catherine Gansleben. to give an intervention. So Catherine, just to introduce you, Catherine's the head of the group on air pollution, environment and health at the European Environment Agency. So we'll be giving the European agency perspective here. She leads a team working on environmental risks to health and estimating the associated burden of disease. And she has a doctorate in economic geography from the University of Oxford and a postdoctorate on urban ecosystems from the Institute of Advanced Studies in Tokyo. So, Catherine, please.
Thank you, and good morning. It's working, yeah? I have to admit, I didn't know I had to give an intervention, so I'm going to wing it. And I think just to pick up on some of what you said, Zoe, and also what we heard this morning, I think there's a very clear rationale that the agencies need to work together. We do work together already. Under COVID, we coordinated both on organizational aspects, but also on the content, on our knowledge around COVID. There are, however, some barriers to that coordination, and I think it's important to recognize that the different agencies have quite different mandates. Some are implementing agencies with really profound roles in legislation, such as EFSA and ECHA. And EEA is an independent agency. We have, I would say, more independence in our knowledge production. And those different mandates mean that when we come together, we need to spend time to understand each other's perspective. And if we do want to work more together on One Health, which I fully support, I think we need resources and time dedicated to that process. And I would even suggest that, if you're asking for a concrete suggestion, Bernhard, that we set up a working group across the agency on One Health, and we sit together and we look at what the One Health concept is, which, if I'm honest, is quite complicated to understand. And we really look at where the roles of the different agencies sit under that overarching concept and what we can bring to the table. And on the basis of that understanding, we could even make a joint statement of, which agency does what on One Health and how we intend to move forward together. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and well done. Good wigging. And so the third of our panelists is Pekka Jokelainen. Pekka works at the Statens Serum Institute in Copenhagen, Denmark, a well-known centre for One Health, with work that focuses on One Health and infectious disease preparedness. She's been extensively involved in research projects, EU research projects, coordinating projects looking at science to policy translation. She's also the president of the Scandinavian Baltic Society for Parasitology and the first vice president of the World Federation of Parasitologists. Pekka, from your background and your perspective, involved very actively in research in One Health. A short intervention.
Thank you. I would like to highlight an ongoing One Health initiative in Europe, One Health European Joint Programme, where I am one of the members of the project management team. And those who maybe don't know it so well, so it's an ongoing initiative bringing together 44 partners across Europe from the fields of public health, animal health, and food safety, to work together with focus on foodborne zoonoses, antimicrobial resistance, and emerging threats. And I think it's really interesting example of how to do One Health in Europe, and especially also that we have really in the structures and in the way of working, we have several of these science policy interfaces. And I hope it's one of these inspiring examples that people can learn about and go forward. And you mentioned my institute, Statens Serum Institute, indeed is a One Health institute. And from there, my experience is that One Health has to happen in different levels. So it's important, it's in the labs, it's in the research groups, it's in the international projects, it's in the collaboration with the stakeholders. And I think it's the way of working, and there it's very important, this cross-border threats is really important. So it cannot be small groups. We also need to work together at the European level, certainly. Thank you.
Thank you. So as I say, please post any questions that you might have. And I see that we have a question from Patrick Howe in the audience. And I'll read the question, and then we decide who's going to go first in answering it. So thinking about future sustainability regulation, and having heard interventions this morning, I think there should be a chapter in the regulation on streamlining mandates of EU NV agencies. Well, Catherine, you talked a little bit about this, the agencies and the need for clarity of our roles and our mandates, perhaps an improved understanding. This is talking about streamlining mandates. Do you think there's a need to streamline the mandates, or is it actually more a question of making them better understood?
I mean, the mandates of the regulation of the agencies are in their regulations. And so to make changes to those is in itself a policy process, right? So this is I'm assuming, the regulation on the sustainable use of pesticides that's being referred to here. And there, I think, in terms of the ways in which the different agencies contribute, it is very different. Of course, EFSA has a key role working on pesticides, looking at the approval of active substances, which is the individual risk assessment. I know that EFSA has made major efforts to lift that assessment up to look more ecosystem impacts and a broader environmental assessment. At EEA, we don't do individual risk assessment, but what we do try and do is look at the total use by society of chemicals, including pesticides, and to understand the impacts of those use on ecosystems more broadly and also on human health. And in doing that, we also look at trends, right? So social trends like changes in consumption patterns, changes in imports and exports of food, changes in energy prices, which all influence the food system and ultimately our use of pesticides. So I think we produce knowledge at very different scales that can complement each other in our total understanding of how pesticides, in this case, impact on human health and the environment.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know if any other members wanted to comment on that at all. Yes, please.
I could continue on that from the side of when now, for example, reading all the call texts for the next opportunities for funding, and there is very often mentioned also that the work should align with the work of the agencies, and it is also for the researchers' side, it's difficult to really understand often the agencies, especially with One Health, because I mean, people I work mainly with, we know ECDC well, and many of us know EFSA well, and I mean, it's like everybody has the agency they know the best from their normal work. And when we work together, it's quite challenging also on that side. So I don't know either if it's streamlining, but at least better understanding, and maybe there was a promise from Bernhard to do better, so I hope all the sister agencies could pick this up. Clarify these mandates and the roles.
I mean, just before Zoe, I've invite Zoe to come in. Of course, having a hub where actually researchers could talk to all agencies at once, that might help with this. I'll ask Zoe to comment, but it looks like Catherine would like to come back on that.
Yeah, I mean, I was just listening to what you were saying, actually, but I mean, I think we do have that to some extent, right? So in the partnership on One Health, EEA is in the advisory board, my colleague Dario Piselli, and we also have the other agencies in the advisory board. Similarly, for a recent project, HBM4U, on human exposure to chemicals, the agencies were involved in an EU policy board providing input. And I think the same thing is foreseen very much for PARC, the partnership on the assessment of chemical risks, where the agencies are actually partners in a Horizon Europe project and involved in steering the definition of the research. So I think through that kind of engagement and through interactions with the research world, we can begin to understand each other better. And I think, you know, I often think of EEA as a bridge between the research world, the science, and the policymakers. That's our job. But even between us at EEA and the scientists, we need to build a bridge. We need to have common understanding, common language, and take time to interact with one another. And all of that requires resources for us to be able to spend time with you to understand and talk to each other and help shape a really important, robust research agenda.
Okay, thank you. And Zoe?
Well, I think when we're coming to risk-assessed pesticides, there's so much information that's submitted by industry. So that sort of raises questions, especially if there's data gaps. I would like to see ICA doing some sort of data verification and possibly their own sort of testing methods to verify the quality of the data that's been submitted, which is why I think sort of an overarching agency that can aggregate all the information, especially if there's an inconsistent approach between the Chemicals Agency and the Food Standards Agency. And I'll take one example. You know, there was a recent neonicotinoid chemical that's been banned for outdoor use on crops by EFSA, and we all understand the reasons for this is the sort of detrimental effect on pollinators. However, the EMA authorised use, continues to authorise use for the same chemical on our household pets and in intensive animal farming. So, you know, how do you sort of square that gap? So I think if we had a sort of specialist sort of regulatory agency to look at the sort of One Health and the impact on ecosystems, it would certainly help us to sort of wade through the mountain of information that we're provided for. So I don't think there is a lack of research per se, but it's trying to sort of use your judgment and yeah, thank you.
Okay, I mean, for me, I think there are a couple of points there that, you know, that perhaps for researchers it's difficult to know what the landscape is in terms of different agencies' roles and involvement and expertise. That it is important that agencies do work with researchers, agencies work together. But, you know, I'm sure that we could know more about how we work together. And again, mechanisms of coming together. I mentioned the sub-network of chief scientists of the EU agencies is one way that we bring the agencies together in that scientific sphere. But perhaps a hub, which would be a point that researchers could come to, might be beneficial. I see we have another couple of questions on the board here. So let me see. I'll start with one which is a nice one. Inspiring discussions this morning, so well done, everyone. Thanks to presenters and panelists. Questions for the panel. How could research underpinning regulatory science anticipate the methodologies, data and expertise needed for assessing the safety of innovation in the food system, e.g. cell-cultured meat, NGTs? That's quite a long question, isn't it? So how could research anticipate the methodologies, data and expertise needed for assessing? So I guess that's a question about, you know, the forward look. How do we ensure that we have the right tools in place? I don't know if anyone would like to take that one. Please.
I can start with that. I think one thing to be more prepared for the changes in the future and how we can address them with the research is to build those collaborations now. I mean, on those topics that we have at hand now. And very important exactly is to always have listen to the trends and see where it's going and be expanding then the groups. But I think it's about the kind of the trust in the groups and when we work with the cross-sector topics and interdisciplinary topics. So these are now some examples mentioned, but thinking even further to the future, we don't know the research questions we need to address, but I think we can make those collaborations and structures ahead.
Thank you. Actually, Zoe, I'm thinking the question is that, you know, we face many, many challenges, I mean, not only in the EU, globally, such as climate change or loss of biodiversity and the animal health diseases. And we've heard already that transdisciplinary or multidisciplinary science policy interfaces are needed to support governance and decision-making policy. But from your perspective in the European Parliament, how can we make the science policy interfaces most effective? What is it, how do you see that, that we can make it even more effective?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I think we really need to sort of condense down the information to sort of key points, especially when we're working with highly complex sorts of situations such as climate change. But yeah, I think the core business of the agencies itself isn't actually research. We need to take account of as much independent research as data as possible. So I think we need to open up debate to sort of include wider society, civil society organisations, yeah.
Okay. I don't know if anybody else would like to. Is that?
Maybe just one reflection from my side, which is, ultimately the research community is ahead of the policy community, right, in terms of conceptual ideas. And so we were talking just before about how this One Health concept is very embedded now, I would say, in the research community. It's been around for some time, it's not new. But if you look on the policy side at the structures of governance, both at national level, but also at EU level, we still have silos, right? So we have a Ministry of Health, we have DG Santé, we have a Ministry of Environment, we have DG Environment, so there's separations at the governance level. So essentially, if we're producing knowledge that is pushing at a structure that isn't necessarily equipped to respond to that knowledge, then there's going to be challenges. And I think we see with the Commission's Farm to Fork Biodiversity Strategy, Zero Pollution, that at that strategic level, the One Health concept is captured. But if you look at the underlying regulation, we still have silo regulation. We don't have an actual policy that's a regulation or a directive that links environment, health, and animal health. So there's a disparity between the knowledge and the governance structures in place to absorb that knowledge.
Okay. So, Zoe, from your perspective, do you see that same that gap? That you perceive that there is this, that the One Health is not quite so embedded in the policy side?
Well, I think the science is clear, and we have enough research. The information is all out there, but what we are lacking is a sort of political will, I guess, to make the necessary changes to obviously in the fight against climate change or antimicrobial resistance. Recently there was a legislation put in place, taking into account the different disciplines to fight against antimicrobial resistance. And what we're actually finding is that there's a gap there where, the interests of intensive farming is meant that we don't actually have any reserve antibiotics, just exclusively for human use.
Okay. I mean, the key theme running through this, of course, is research and the way in which EU agencies can benefit EU research, both in terms of identifying priorities and needs and policies and in translation. But can I ask each of you, and perhaps I'll start with you, Catherine, as someone from an agency, but what do you think are the main barriers that are preventing agencies from being more involved in research? And do you have any thoughts on how those barriers might be overcome?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I would say that I think in the agencies, a lot of people come from a research background. There are many people who understand academia, so they're well equipped to engage with the research community. The main barrier, I think, is time and resources. The agencies have jobs to do, and most of our core resources are dedicated to delivering on those tasks. And in some ways, we can get trapped in hubris then, right? We're implementing these tasks and we don't take time to step back and look at the research community and the new knowledge and say, is this the right thing? Should we change these methods? Should we change this approach? What are the changes in society that mean we're facing new challenges? So I think there's a time issue. I would also say, though, we do engage with the research community. I mean, at EEA, as I said, we were a partner in HBM3U. We're a partner in the partnership on the assessment of the risks of chemicals. We engage with a whole range of research projects on advisory boards, because part of our job is to harvest knowledge and feed it to policymakers. And, you know, we've talked a lot this morning about what we need to do better, and I actually think we do a pretty good job. You know, I think if you look at the world, Europe is ahead in terms of how we harvest scientific knowledge and feed it into policy making. So, you know, I don't want to celebrate ourselves too much, but I think we should recognize what we've achieved as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I would like to continue on that. I agree very much. I can observe the same thing from our side. And another thing is timing. It's the time, but it's also the timing, because all the agencies have a kind of strategic plans forward, and then the lifetime of the different projects and initiatives, it's usually limited. And this is also a challenge, how to engage the agencies to the work when it makes sense. And in One Health EJP, I think we have been successful in that sense, that the key EU stakeholders, ECDC and EFSA, so you were involved, for example, in giving input to the second call of projects, like really what are the needs and the topics for that. And that has been so useful then to make that gap-based research, and there's already interest from the agency side, and then discussing the outcomes. And I think that helps with the sustainability of the research and the work done too, because there's already the need. We don't need to use time to tell that this is important. We can agree on that.
Yeah.
I think that, I have to say, I think that that's really, really helpful. I mean from the researcher's perspective, the value you see in the EU agencies in their role in working with networks of regulators and public health professionals and others in understanding where the needs are. And I think that perhaps that also picks up on a point that Bernhard made in his talk about the importance of actionable research, and that actually the research, the choice of research, the decisions about what it should deliver should be actionable. And many of the EU agencies are working hand in glove with those who are responsible for taking action at a national level. So I think the point you made there is really helpful. Catherine.
Sorry, yes, just what you were saying really triggered something in my mind, and also what you said, Pika, which I think is the policy processes are extremely time-driven. So if we want to produce knowledge to influence a policy process, the information has to come out at the moment when the Commission is drafting the revised directive so that it feeds into the proposal, or when the co-decision process is taking place, when you are debating it in the Parliament and the Council. So, for example, yesterday I was talking to people who are producing knowledge on pesticides, and I was saying, you have to make the knowledge now and give it to us now, because the Commission has just launched the revised directive on the sustainable use of pesticides. We need the knowledge to influence the co-decision process. And they're like, oh yes, but we're only going to have it in a year. And I'm like, that's too late. It's too late. So this issue of timing is so crucial, and I think through these discussions where we're on your advisory boards, we can help you to understand those policy timeframes.
I could add to that exactly, because I think in One Health EJP we've been having regular meetings with the stakeholders committee, so twice a year, plus also connection during other times, but because then that's the time to tell, like, in the next half a year, next year we are planning this, and then it's like usually actually the projects are quite able to adapt the timelines and maybe provide some outcomes earlier, or so it's I think it starts with the discussion early on, so that helps with the timing. That's because it's a pity if something comes too late, then it's a waste. Yeah.
Zoe.
I think one of the main barriers, like most everything, is when it comes down to a lack of resources, whether it's like financial or human resources. So that is the sort of pressure that we're all seeing, and it's a fact of life. But you know, I would really like to see some further investment made, as I mentioned, so that we're not actually fully relying on the data that's submitted by the industry, especially when it comes to revision of reassessment of pesticides like glyphosate and other substances.
Thank you. And just Catherine's point that actually it's not all black. I mean, the agencies are clearly involved. But I think that, you know, I'm just reflecting on the point that Robert Gorcom made, you know, the Court of Auditors report, you know, where the feeling that actually that the agencies can actually contribute to cooperation on policies and involvement, and the implicit in that is that more could be done. So I mean, I think we should never be too complacent, but I do agree that clearly there is engagement. Let us look to see what other questions we have from the audience. So there's a question here from Lydia Delgado Calva Flores, which is, the speakers have talked extensively about collaboration amongst the ENVI agencies and its importance to bridge research and policy. But what about the role of the Joint Research Centre? This is the European Commission's Joint Research Centre in this process. I mean, it's a great question, and in actual fact, the agencies, and particularly through the sub-network of chief scientists of the agency, the ANSA network, we work very closely with the JRC. They are members of that. And if you look at the COVID response, which is something which is probably, I know quite a lot about at the moment, is that we work very closely with JRC and actually work collaboratively and shared out tasks, particularly related to modelling, which is such a big issue, still is, but particularly in the early days, what's going to happen with COVID, what will be the effect and impact of interventions, and ECDC and JRC work very closely on that, co-developed models, co-developed a database of responses. It's available on the internet, all the responses at the national level across all the EU countries. So I wouldn't want anybody to think that JRC are somehow outside of this. The agencies do work closely with JRC already. Question from Francesca Colli. In your opinion, what does implement a One Health approach mean in practical terms? Is it just a matter of coordination, communication, and working groups? What about procedures? Pika?
I can go first.
Yes.
I would actually like to repeat a quote from yesterday's roundtable I was chairing, where Professor Thomas Mettenleiter, who is the president of FLI and co-chair of the One Health high-level expert panel, was saying that One Health is a way of living. And I would say it's also like a way of working and a way of addressing things and so on. So I think that is kind of the implementing a One Health approach, is that just understanding these things are connected and how important it is to work together. So I feel like it's the way of doing things is the key in that, and I think that's the way of moving forward also. So,
yeah, maybe to build on what you just said there, Pika, for me, One Health it's kind of a conceptual challenge to this Christian perspective of humanity as distinct from the animal and plant kingdom, right? That we're somehow superior. The reality is we're a species, right? We're an animal ourselves. We're profoundly dependent upon ecosystems for our survival. And I just want to share with you this really crazy statistic, which for me encapsulates this. And that is that on planet Earth, if we look at biomass, and we look at the biomass of livestock, there's 10 times the biomass of livestock than there is of wild birds and mammals. 10 times. And there's more than 50% more livestock than human beings. So we, through our intensive meat production processes, have fundamentally changed the whole structure of animal life on planet Earth. And I think that's the challenge that you introduced at the beginning, Bernhard, right? About the profound unsustainability of our food systems. So that, for me, is part of the challenge that we need to change. And so it's not just about coordination and procedures. It's about a conceptual change in our mind frames of what is the place of humans on Earth.
Well, I would agree with every word that you say, Catherine, and that's partly why the Farm to Fork strategy is asking people to make the necessary changes to bring consumption within the planetary boundaries. And we're not asking people to go vegan. You know, we should be eating less meat and better quality meat and moving away from intensive agricultural models to more sustainable, eco-friendly models. Because at the end of the day, you know, what we're doing to our planet, we're literally consuming our children's future, and you know, and we're seeing sort of mass sort of populations of extinction for specific species. So we can't just retreat back into our sort of national silos because we share the planet with many other living things.
Okay, so a good question. And one more question, a very broad question. Right from the beginning of the session with Bernhard's intervention and wishes about there, there's a sense of urgency in this, clearly, for more resilient, sustainable food systems. But in terms of when does the transition need to start happening, who should be taking the first step? You know, where do you see the role of agencies in that, researchers, policymakers, and Zoe?
Yeah, I think, I mean, undoubtedly we all have a part to play, but ultimately it will come down to the regulators and the national governments. You know, unfortunately we're sort of tied to a system that's fundamentally flawed and unsustainable. And if we don't make the necessary changes soon, you know, we're going to run out of time. You know, the information from the IPCC is clear, and we really need to bring sort of food production back within the sort of the planetary boundaries. I don't know if you saw the news reports the other day, you know, where the Secretary General of the United Nations had actually said that fossil fuel companies literally have humanity by the throat, you know, when he compared the lack of action towards climate. It's very similar to what we saw with the tobacco industries denying that smoking causes cancer. So a lot more needs to be done, but each and every one of us has a part to play. But you know, it's not enough to put full responsibility onto the individuals because society is quite restricted. You know, dealing with the sort of cost of living crisis. So we need real leadership and political will to make the necessary change.
Catherine?
Yes, I mean, I agree with Zoe's points on kind of political lock-ins and interest groups and power dynamics, which are, of course, influencing how we respond. You know, I'm a bit more of an optimist, so I do see real demand in society for action on sustainability and climate change, particularly amongst young people. And I think the European Green Deal responded to that demand quite cleverly, I think. I think that one thing we could do is change the voting age to 16 so that young people have more influence over politics. I think we would have more progressive politics if we did that. That's another discussion, of course. But I think something that we all found just insane with the COVID experience was how willing we were to change all those economic systems and change our homes, change our education systems because of a very immediate threat to health where we thought we might die because of an infectious disease. And yet we've been talking about climate change for 30 years and the progress, as you say, is glacial. I mean, we're heading towards a probably 3 to 5 degree increase of temperature. We had the highest emissions last year in 2020 last year of any year. So, you know, how do we respond to risk? How do we manage risk as a society? The difference between an acute risk to health and a chronic risk long-term where, you know, we don't necessarily know anyone who's died, so it's not that frightening.
I would continue that you asked, like, who should take the first step? I think steps are already taken, and if somebody has not noticed, then needs to go ahead and run with them. So I think we are walking there already, and I would say the young people are likely running in front, so we should pick up the pace. That's more the thing. But I would say, like, it's all of us in our different roles. We are also part of the society, and it's more like we should take those steps and maybe change to running. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, perfect way to end this session. Thank you very much, all of you, for giving those different perspectives. I think there are many issues and themes that we'll be picking up on in the next part of this meeting. But now is the opportunity for networking, coffee, comfort breaks, all those important things that make conference successful. So please, could I ask you first of all to thank our panel members, Zoe Dingwall, Catherine Gansleben, and Pekka Jokelainen, for excellent presentation. Welcome back, everybody, to the second half of this session on the science policy interface. So we're going to start this session with a real-life case study, which is looking very much at interagency collaboration. In the program originally, the talk was going to be given by Ernesto Ibana from EFSA, who unfortunately is indisposed because ECDC didn't prevent COVID. So it's delighted to say that we have in place, but online, Valentina Rizzi, who is from EFSA. Now, Valentina is a veterinarian with expertise in food microbiology and food safety, and she's been working at EFSA since 2008 as a senior scientific officer, and she coordinates the team in charge of the production of annual European Union summary reports on zoonoses, including antimicrobial resistance. So Valentina is going to give the presentation now, entitled Making a Difference, Bridging EU Research and Policy, a real-life case study on antimicrobial resistance. So hopefully I can see Valentina. Great. Valentina, over to you.
Thank you very much. And good morning, everybody. Thanks for the introduction. Can you hear me well? Okay, I can start. And today I'm going to give a very short talk regarding this bridging EU research, monitoring, risk assessment and policy in the area of antimicrobial resistance. And as the chair mentioned already, I would like to do so giving some real case studies of activity of EFSA in collaboration with the other sister agencies. The antimicrobial resistance is a very complex and multifactorial problem that should be for sure tackled with in One Health approach. And it's been estimated that antimicrobial resistance causes, at least in the European Union, around 33,000 human deaths per year. So it's a very important topic. But before going to concrete example, I would like to set the scene at European Union level. And you can see that there are already initiatives at EU level regarding the implementation of One Health for antimicrobial resistance. You can see that there is this EU One Health network for antimicrobial resistance. The last meeting was in January 2022 in order to revamp the activity of this network. And this network is coordinated by the Commission with the participation of governmental experts, the EU agencies, and also Commission. And the aim of this network is really to bring together experts from different sectors, human side, the veterinary side, environmental sector, to adopt also proposals coming from the European Council on antimicrobial resistance, and also to propose antimicrobial resistant provision during the revision of the EU pharmaceutical legislation. Another scope of this network is also to implement the recommendation of the EU One Health Action Plan against antimicrobial resistance that the Commission launched in 2017, based on three main pillars. The first, to make the EU a best practice region. The second one, to foster the development, research and innovation. and the third one to shape the global agenda regarding antimicrobial resistance. And then you see that the network wants also to implement, to adopt the recommendation from the Council that would like to shape the common approach that the member state should implement in order to fight antimicrobial resistance. And just an example is regarding the possible targets at country level. Still at European Union, with reference to farm to fork strategy, you know that there are many targets, reduction targets that have been set in order to create, to build this legislative framework for sustainable food system. And among these targets, there is one specific for antimicrobial resistance. And you can see that this target refers to the reduction by 50% of sales of antimicrobial for farmed animal and also in aquaculture. And now I would like to go more in detail about the real case studies that EFSA was involved in, but also together with the other agencies. And in this case was an effort to put together different components, and you can see represented in the slides. We are speaking about research, monitoring, risk assessment, and policy, and these are interconnected in different ways. I will start with few examples where the main elements are monitoring, risk assessment, and research. First of all, going directly to the legislation regarding monitoring of antimicrobial resistance at EU level. EFSA started already many years ago in 2012, providing scientific advice to the European Commission regarding monitoring and reporting on antimicrobial resistant data. And these recommendations were incorporated in the decision 652 from 2013 that requires the member state to provide, according to the Zoonosis Directive, monitoring data on an annual basis for antimicrobial resistance. And these technical specifications were implemented for many years. After the evolution of the situation in the countries regarding antimicrobial resistance, and also after audit implemented by the G-Santé and the Court of Auditors, EFSA was requested to provide an update about these technical specifications, and these were incorporated in the new decision 1729 from 2020 that extended a bit the scope of the previous decision, because in this case, the monitoring cover also the imported meat. All these monitoring data are annually analyzed and put together with human data provided by CDC in order to provide this really One Health European Union summary report on antimicrobial resistance, which is done by EFSA in collaboration with the CDC. And the main objective of this report are really to monitor the situation of antimicrobial resistance, but from a public health perspective, to describe the occurrence of resistance in humans and animal population, and also to follow the temporal trends, but also to provide indication about the combined resistance to critically important antimicrobial for human medicines. And finally, to give also an overview about the key outcome indicator of resistance, that are indicators that countries, but also the European Commission, can use to follow, to monitor the situation at country level and at EU level. All these monitoring data are also used in risk assessment and used in many opinions that EFSA has produced. But we spoke about research also, and research is very important. So EFSA is investing a lot in research capacity building, but also funded a lot of projects. I mentioned here only some: Innuendo, Engage, GeneCamp. And EFSA is also member of the advisory boards of other projects. For example, here Compare, which is funded by Commission DG Research. All these projects that I mentioned in this slide are regarding new technologies, new methodologies, in particular whole genome sequencing. And exactly this new methodology has been incorporated in the new decision that I mentioned before and has been recommended as an alternative method for specific isolate reported by the member state. But in order to perform this activity of monitoring, according to the new requirement, there was required the support of the European Reference Laboratory for Antimicrobial Resistance, who was in charge for development of the protocol, but also the support of EFSA, that implemented an open source bioinformatic tools pipeline based on the protocol of the European Reference Laboratories in order to allow the extraction of the resistant genes from the raw data. And these genes could then be submitted by the country to EFSA according to the Zoonosis Directive. There are then other examples, other case studies regarding the interaction between monitoring and policy control. And you can see here an example that probably was mentioned also this morning, the JACRA report, that provide an integrated analysis between antimicrobial consumption and occurrence of antimicrobial resistance in humans and animal populations. And this is a very excellent example of cross-sectoral analysis of data and strict collaboration between three agencies, EFSA, ECDC, and also the European Medicine Agency. So far, 3 reports have been produced, the last one in June 2021, sorry. And the main conclusion of this 3rd report was that the reduction of antimicrobial consumption have for sure a beneficial impact on the reduction of antimicrobial resistance. So it's very important to put more effort in the prudent use of antimicrobial agents, but also to focus on prevention and control of infection. This report highlighted also that there are still some countries with high consumption of antimicrobial and high antimicrobial resistance levels. So it's still important that interventions are reinforced. There are other cases where different other components are interlinked. And you can see here from risk assessment to monitor, but also involvement of data gaps identification and then policy control. And an example of this interaction of different components, different disciplines, is in this report that was published some years ago by EFSA and EMA, the RONAFA report. The aim of this report was to identify the measure in order to reduce the needs for and the use of antimicrobial substances. And the conclusion of this report was in 3 different groups, in particular 3 different pillars. The first one, the first recommendation was to reduce the use of antimicrobials. And for example, this was done by setting targets at country level, or also monitoring the prescription of antimicrobial or limiting the use of critical important antimicrobial to specific situations. Another recommendation was to replace the usual antimicrobial with new substances, and also with other substances like probiotic, prebiotic, organic acid. And finally, to rethink about the animal population system, animal production system. For example, promoting the concept of prevention and control of diseases. And all these recommendations have been already incorporated in the legislation for veterinary medicinal product, but also in the farm-to-fork strategy. Another example is this opinion regarding feed residues. In particular, this opinion was produced by EFSA, but with the support of EMA, and the scope was to identify the level of antimicrobial resulting from the cross-contamination in non-targeted feed below which the development of antimicrobial resistance is not expected. In this case, 24 substances have been tested, evaluated, but due to data gaps, the opinion was conclusive only for 6 of them. And the report highlighted also the data gaps and also some research needs. There is also another opinion, very important, related to the environment. And in this case, there is really the huge agency cooperation. This was an opinion of EFSA, but the contribution was from the 3 agencies, EMA, EEA, and ECDC. And in this case, the scope of the mandate was to identify the role played by the environment for the emergence and spread of antimicrobial-resistant bacteria and genes through the food chain. And in this case, the report identified the most important source and transmission route for antimicrobial resistance, but also suggested mitigation options and identified gaps, data gaps, and research needs that are going to feed the future European Commission research agenda, in line also with the action plan against antimicrobial resistance of the Commission. And finally, there is another mandate that is still ongoing, and is a mandate that EFSA has received from the European Parliament. This is regarding the risk of spread of antimicrobial resistance through animal transport from farm to slaughterhouse. In this case, the report should identify risk factors, but should also suggest mitigation options and also identify data gaps and possible future research in order to close these gaps. And the report will be finalized by November 2022. I would like to conclude with some take-home messages and final remarks. So we have seen that One Health approach is really essential for antimicrobial resistance, which is a complex and multifactorial problem. In my talk, I gave some example of very successful interagency collaboration, which is really crucial to tackle this problem. But there is still some work to be done in order to create and foster the partnership between research funding body, risk management, and risk assessment. And this is very crucial in order to ensure that the usability of the data generated by this research. And this morning was mentioned the concept of actionable evidence, actionable research. There is another concept that I didn't mention so far in my presentation, which is the societal concern that was raised in the Eurobarometer on antimicrobial resistance. And this is a very important point that should be taken into consideration in the political agenda and also in the policy, in order to reassure the consumer that the protection of public health is the top priority. And in this context, in this regard, I would like to stress the importance to have a joint effort between the different agencies, but also between all stakeholders, in order to improve communication to everybody. And with this, I would like to include also general publics, consumers, in order to raise in them the awareness of the problem of antimicrobial resistance, and also to foster, to improve the education of different actors, for example, farmers, veterinarians for the prescription of antibiotics, and also to foster the engagement of all stakeholders involved in this area. And with this take-home message, I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Valentina, thanks so much. Very clear, and many nice examples there of ongoing collaborations between agencies and the outputs from those. So now we move to the final part of this session on policy and science and policy, which will be where we will have a panel on stage, and the main purpose of this is to have a dialogue with you, the audience. This is where we, the agencies, really would like to get your views and thoughts on, for example, how that link between we as agencies can strengthen that link between science and policy, whether that's through engagement in priority setting, or the conduct, or the translation of research. Any thoughts on collaborative working between agencies and others, and engagement mechanisms, policymakers, research funders, society, and possibly this issue about whether or not a joint EU agency science hub would be a tool for that. So we're really looking for your input here, but before that I'd like to invite members of the panel up. So it will be some of the members, panel members are up before, but also we have each of the ENVI agencies represented, if you count myself as well. Let me just introduce, ask the members to come up. So that's Wim de Koen, Zoe Dingwall, Catherine Gansleben, Tony Humphreys, Pika Jokalainen, and of course Bernhard Url. So while they're gathering, can I just sort of brief bio you? I've introduced most of the members, but there are two that are new. So Wim de Koen is head of unit in the Directorate of Hazard Assessment in the European Chemicals Agency. He's been working in ECHA since 2008, so it says here. Before that, he worked in JRC, and before that was a professor of biochemistry at the University of Antwerp, where he led pioneering research on molecular methods for risk assessment of chemicals. So Wim here, the European Chemicals Agency, and we also have Tony Humphreys on the end there. So he Tony's from the European Medicines Agency, the EMA, which he joined in 1996. So a long-standing member of the EU agency community. And since 1996, he has fulfilled a variety of managerial positions. In 2020, he was appointed head of the Regulatory Science and Innovation Task Force, where he had responsibility for a range of functions, including, amongst others, operation of a regulatory science observatory, addressing emerging innovations, and coordination of regulatory science research activities. So we have a wealth of expertise on the panel, and this is really about, this is a dialogue, a panel audience dialogue. So we are totally dependent on you fulfilling your part of the bargain there, which is to post some questions. And for the very last time, please can I ask that if you have questions, you post them using the app. We have a screen there, we can see them, and we will try and answer them. It would be helpful if your question is specifically for one member of the panel to address, if you could put at the beginning of the question which panel member you would like to respond. As I said, we have each of the ENVI agencies. I will be doing two roles, one chairing, but also if you have questions specific for ECDC, happy to answer those. I will move over there now, and we will start the panel discussion. So we have a question here waiting from Veronica Latanzio, which is, I think it could be for any or all. Is there, or will it be foreseen that there will be a structured pathway to enable European agencies to officially take up outputs generated by other science, policy, society interfaces? A structured pathway. I think we've heard many examples of how agencies work with research collaborations. Was there a benefit in a structured pathway? Bernhard, perhaps you'd like to go first.
Yeah, Thank you. I find it a very interesting question. And I would have two views on that. The one is we look at every evidence that is out there and check whether it's relevant and reliable. And if it's relevant and reliable, we use it in our risk assessment. So basically, you could say there is a pathway because we look at evidence. We are obliged to look not only at the evidence that industry provides, but at all scientific evidence that is out there, at least for the last 10 years, and use it. However, there's an interesting notion I find, maybe in this question, is sometimes we think we have to produce evidence again because we don't really trust the others. When I worked in Austria, we called it the not invented here syndrome, which means if we hadn't done it, we didn't trust it, so we did it again. And I think this is a bit of a European phenomenon that that maybe might point to this structured pathway that we don't have enough trust to reuse evidence that others have produced. So there's something to do, I think. I think it starts with trust, that we can rely what the others have done is useful. And you know, building trust is one of the main aims of this conference, so we are building this structure.
Absolutely, and I think that actually in Valentina's presentation, if we think about the GIACRA report, this joint interagency report, we don't question each other's science and evidence, whether it's medicine agencies' data on consumption, or from EFSA, the antimicrobial resistance patterns in animals, and for us, the humans, and and we don't try and reinvent that. So that there are examples of that. I see lots of hands, but I think it was Wim, Pika, and then Tony.
Yeah, I think this is an excellent question, and I mean you can look at it from different perspectives. How it is done now, how it should be done. I think this comes for the moment very much to the surface through PARC, our partnership on the risk assessment of chemicals, where actually the agencies play a fundamental role in translating in a structured way what this output ideally should be to be usable for, let's say, the regulators or for the agency. So there, I think there's already some foundation. What is missing, of course, is the One Health dimension. There is not a current, I would say, framework that would provide for a One Health debate, sustainability, as we've been discussing it here, safety in all its dimensions. It's still fragmented. So a structured pathway for a One Health approach, I think that would be brilliant. So I think I would definitely applaud that way forward.
Thank you, Wim. Pika, you.
I would like to add to that one kind of structure is that these research consortia and projects, we have science policy interfaces not only to the EU agencies, but for example, One Health EJP, we work closely with the national stakeholders, so the ministries, and also the global ones, so the tripartites. And our way of doing it is that we gather the stakeholder committee together, and I think that's also like interesting to take a use of this, that the different level science policy interfaces could be joined sometimes.
Thank you. And Tony.
Yeah, I mean, it's the area, we do have sort of a structured pathway, particularly for new methodologies, and particularly with the sort of sector that we're dealing with. It's an incredibly expensive, very complex development process, and if people are going to apply the very latest novel methodologies, be it in production techniques, be it in clinical trial evidence generation, etc., they need to have a strong signal from the regulator that it's going to be acceptable at the end, because otherwise, they're blocked, and that's a major problem. And we have a number of ways of doing that. One is a very specific qualification advice opinion process where we essentially validate, and that's a quasi-public process, and it gives confidence then to the sector to roll that into their development area. And the other then, of course, is to issue things like concept papers, reflection papers, something that gives a public insight into the mind of the regulator, let's say in an emerging area like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the use of sort of medical applications. But without that, we often find there's hesitancy to adopt the very novel sort of technologies simply because it's too high a risk for the development, and then they will stay in the more conventional space. And I think collectively we've seen that in the 3 Rs area. We've talked about 3 Rs for decades now, but when we actually look into the actual submissions, etc., we see very little utilization, actual translation into the end product. And we have to really understand, how can we build confidence in the sort of the development side of things such that they can adopt those methodologies. And that's a sort of, the regulator then has got to take the lead on that. And I think that's something that we can collaborate on in building confidence in those new methodologies.
Thank you. So, I mean, I think one of the take-homes there is each of the agencies has a fairly structured approach to reviewing the science, have different mechanisms whereby we engage with research initiatives, and part of our work is undoubtedly the translation that we, through the synthesis of the evidence that's been produced either by agencies or more often by others, we then translate that into guidance, policy advice and others. But I think Wim's point is a good one, is whether we should be using unifying initiatives, whether it's One Health, the Green Deal, to actually think about whether the agencies should be working together. And Bernhard mentioned at the beginning the idea of there's some kind of a hub or something like that, which could do that. And of course, we also have this EU answer network of scientists, and perhaps this is a good topic for discussion in that network. So thank you for that question. There was a question here from Antoon Opperhuizen. In the introduction, the differences of mandates was mentioned, but is this limiting in terms of providing advice based on anticipated scientific research? Is there a need for more guidance stroke influence of risk managers, politicians, or is there a need for less influence? So I think this is getting at, the agencies have different mandates, and partly reflecting, I think, the domain of work, also partly reflecting the timing at which those mandates were developed and the political environment with which they were written. But is this a limiting factor? And I'm not sure. Does anybody want to answer that, Catherine?
I can make a quick reflection on that. I mean, I think we have been together in collaboration with DG RTD looking to increase the policy orientation of research so that research delivers knowledge that can serve the policy agenda. And there we have all the points on content and timeliness, etc. But I would also make a plea for blue skies research that is completely disassociated from policy objectives. Because if we just have a kind of snake eating its own tail, where the policymakers and the agencies dictate the research agenda, we can miss stuff. So we need that kind of blue skies, open-brained thinking to identify potential emerging risks and stuff we just haven't thought of.
I'm absolutely in support. I'm just going to be slightly challenged that, but I'm completely in support of the need for blue sky research. And I don't think there will ever be a problem in finding advocates for blue sky research. I mean, we would, 50% of postdoc posts in Europe would disappear if we saw that being wiped out. But I do perceive that there's a real gap in what I would call implementation science to really inform policy. And that, for me, is an important gap. And it's an area where I think the agencies are supremely well positioned to provide input. Bernhard.
Yeah, thank you. Coming back to the question of Anton. As you mentioned, the agencies were created in different times for different reasons, most as a response to crisis. And they were given very specific tasks with a founding regulation, with a very specific mandate. And we have 45 of them now in Europe. And I think when we talk about One Health, the agencification that happened in the European policies is now biting us back, because we have fragmented via the agencies also the topic we are talking about very much, with different founding regulations, different mandates, different working methods. We use panels, others don't use panels. We have peer review. We have different methods, different guidelines. So how can we make the advantage of agencies to be small, to be nimble, to be agile, to be technically and scientifically very strong? How can we overcome the fragmentation that we have built into the system? And there Anton asks, I understood the question, would it be useful to have more guidance from the policymakers, risk managers, where the agencies naturally would say, no way, because we are independent, we are autonomous, we don't want guidance, commission, please stay out. I'm exaggerating a bit. So on the other hand, I think we need something like a supra-agency collaboration space, a platform. I wouldn't call it guidance, but maybe a hub, a platform, a community where we can talk exactly about that One Health approach, and not only talk, but translate it into actions of research that we instigate, of work we do, of methods we develop, guidance document. I think there is something missing, and we should strive for that, Mike.
Yep. And
the conference maybe could give us insight in saying, okay, we try something, we can experiment a bit and try to have this supra, and I don't want to call it governance, or, you know, it sounds very bureaucratic, and everybody says, oh no, not another layer of bureaucracy. So we have to be smart.
Yeah. Thank you. Wim.
Yeah, continuing on that, I saw the question more at what is missing, and guidance. I would also think guidance for us agencies, that's maybe, it's non-legal binding, it may be fluffy, so maybe not that, but I think what is missing is a One Health mandate. We all stay in our silos, so to speak, and when there's a crisis, we show we can really add value. We focus, we collaborate, but if you continue like this, you go from fire to fire. And I don't think as a policymaker you want that. So I think to the policymakers around, I think this is definitely something to think about. Whether it's a task force, a hub, if none of the agencies gets it put on the radar, it's always going to be an emergency knee-jerk reaction. It will always be too late. So if we want to be leading still in the world, you need to have a proactive engagement. Resources for sure, a structure, a governance, maybe a big word, but something that gives a path forward, a strategic way that allows the agencies to maybe color a little bit outside the mandate. And a common One Health mandate for the NV agencies would really already be a first step, I think.
Sure. Tony, you
Yeah, I actually see this as a life cycle evolution, and the fact is that, and you very kindly mentioned, I started off in 96, 95, the agency opened up, and we're 25 years old or whatever the hell, and the other agencies on a similar trajectory. But rather than think, oh my God, we've all these silos mandate, one separated from the other, let's not think of these silos as grain silos with concrete walls, but maybe they should be transparent walls. These are valuable reservoirs of expertise, and we need to have transparency about how they're organized and the mobilization of that expert network in Europe and the interconnection between them. And then you say, and what are we going to ask these guys to do? And I would like, I mean, we've talked about the AMR just with the case study just before, but also I'd like to put on the table the Beating Cancer Plan, the cancer mission objective, because I can tell you, when I open up that document with my little medicines lens on, it's a few pages. This is a holistic approach all the way from the cradle to the grave with regards to environmental pollution, tobacco, food, nutrition, education in schools, health literacy, medicines, diagnosis, big data. It's a holistic, the ambition is fantastic. How are we going to deliver it though? We're going to have to come, you know, I think they've even used not just a One Health, they said health in all policies type approach. So I do think the agencies as these, I'd say, transparent silos and pools of valuable expertise are there as a resource to then be focused. And I think we've seen a really good example at a European level on the COVID-19 response, and we could debate that. And what are the next challenges? We've already said AMR, guys, it is the silent pandemic, and let's debate that. And we're not doing enough on it. There's loads of initiatives, World Health Organization, Europe, national, whatever, but my God, it's a really multifactorial challenge, and it's tricky. And it's both on new therapeutics, new technology, but it's also on the stewardship and the surveillance that we're already doing. So it's really hard. But cancer is also hard, and it's going to impact 1 out of every 2 of us in this room at some stage in our lives. But I really think we should see the agencies as a facility, a capability to be utilized by whatever the political will is going forward into the future.
If I could just answer briefly as a panel member rather than as the chair. Personally, I don't think that the differences in our mandates represent a barrier to much. It's a mindset issue. It's about, and I think what we need to do is identify where, and I think we need to bring this back to this whole policy-science interface. This isn't all about just how do we as agencies get on better, but it's actually about how we work together in a way that actually makes us a more useful or a more powerful instrument in ensuring that policy is informed by good science, is my view. And I don't think the difference in mandates get in the way of that at all. There may be a few wrinkles, but I mean, you know, I like to simplify. So that would be my view. Should we move on? So we've got several other questions there. Perhaps I can, just because Robert was on the panel before, says, Robert van Gorcom says, in reply to Bernhard's statement, how can we improve trust in the outcome of science? It starts with the design of the research. Would it work to have a kind of consultation about the design before the studies start to improve this design and the applicability of the outcomes? I mean, I think that I was struck by, I was fortunate enough to be to previous EFSA meetings, and this was the meeting, last one or the last but one of these, where it was very clear that asking the right question is the heart of good science. So I think that the answer, Robert, is yes, I would say. But Bernhard, I mean, I think this is probably directed more to you.
Well, I'm not sure, because it's more about the design of research. No, I'm not sure, Robert, whether you meant the design of the question that I put into the scientific factory of doing risk assessments. I read it more as the design of research. So I think it's much a broader question. From a systemic point of view, you would say the design for research, or let's say the need for research, is a societal question which is collected in a political democratic process. For this, we have elected policymakers, and they then translate it into research programs like DGRTD does. No, that should reflect the need of the society for research. And could we improve the trust in the outcome of research and science by having a more participative and consultative approach when formulating research questions? I think yes. I think that's what we also heard during this conference, that trust needs not only communication, it needs engagement, it needs more than engagement, participation, reflection, not only top-down. So I think from my perspective, the answer is yes, could be much better.
Catherine?
Yeah, perhaps just to complement that, a broader reflection on trust in science. I think 3 or 4 years ago, pre-COVID, we were in a really dark place when it came to trust, social trust in scientific expertise. You know, a lot of that was happening across the Atlantic with Donald Trump and his show, but also here in Europe, and with the Brexit debate, there was all this disparagement of experts. And if COVID brought us something good, it was that we had scientists speaking publicly every single day and being seen as the bastion of truth. And I think that process of going through COVID has reestablished science as a source of trustworthy information.
Okay. A question which has got support from several others in the audience is, that's an interesting question. How do you foresee participation of civil society in the process of bringing the agencies closer together, but also in the translation and dissemination of scientific advice? Who would like to have a go at that? Zoe, do you want to have a go at that? Civil society.
Well, absolutely. I mean, when we have new technologies such as new genomic techniques, I think that really puts the trust in science to the test. You know, I mean, we're really talking about GMOs, and I was hearing someone mention about genetically modified mosquitoes the other day. You know, so there are concerns about what are the long-term effects on our ecosystems. So, you know, if we can open up public debate as far as possible, involve the NGOs and civil society, and get them round the table with the scientists and the policymakers, then we might have a clearer picture on the way forward with these things. But, you know, I'm old enough to remember sort of 30 years ago when GMOs were heralded as, you know, the cure to global famine, you know, and we're still waiting. So I'm a bit skeptical that this will be the sort of magic bullet in terms of climate change mitigation. You know, we really should be a bit skeptical when it comes to these things. It won't be a single solution in itself.
For me, I mean, I think there are two quite distinct questions in this. One is about what or whether there is a role of civil society in bringing. It's actually quite helpful to keep the questions still on the screen, bringing the agencies together. But there was the second part of the question was in civil societies in translation, and I mean, I think absolutely that's that, and I'm sure other agencies have got good examples of this. For ECDC, we have worked very closely with civil society in terms of the very active patient groups that represent those with, say, HIV particularly, and also with industry in terms of those that provide apps specifically for men who have sex with men, and that's been a really important way of reaching out and disseminating science. Wim?
I think it's part of our core role already, and we can give maybe an interesting example of some years ago, from the NAMs, so the alternative methods, and from the civil society and NGOs, you have of course an anti-animal testing interests, which are very valid and which you need to consider in all. If I talk for ECHA, if we ask for animal testing, or if a company wants to do animal testing, they need to get a permit to do that. So we look into available information, and if there's alternatives possible, we will refer to that. At the same time, there is an equal kind of part of the NGO community that will not trust the alternatives. Because if you think of bringing together omics and AOPs, and it's like a black box, you know, do we have the same level of trust? And that's exactly our role. If we want to give advice and translate outcomes of alternatives to be really clear on the scientific technical side, what kind of protection we can still foresee or accept. I think that's daily bread and butter for now already, I think.
Okay, Bernhard.
Yeah, thank you. I think I fully agree what Wim said, that we have a core in communicating and engaging, but I think it's too late when we think we only can communicate and translate outcomes of our work with the help of civil society. We need the civil society at the beginning of the process to be sure that we deal on the right questions, that we see the context. And then we at EFSA try to go a step further and say, where in the scientific process are windows for participation of the civil society? This is part of our stakeholder approach. We know that science is not a polling exercise, like it or not. I once used unwisely the term Facebook science, and it fired back on me, but science also needs closed rooms where experts discuss evidence. But in between, in this process, there are windows where we need the engagement of the civil society. And I think only if we see the full cycle from the framing of the question to giving back the output of science to the society, then this translation, dissemination, anchoring of science within the society can be successful.
I completely agree. Before I come to Pika, Zoe, from the European Parliament perspective, how big a difference would it make to the impact, the credibility of the scientific advice that agencies put forth if it's known that actually it is addressing major concerns expressed by civil society? Does it make a difference?
Well, I think the sort of lack of action that we're seeing, you know, it would certainly help with regards to that, to help people's understanding. I'm fairly sure from the discussions that we've had that, you know, that would be key, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yes. Sorry, just to give an example where we really cooperate with the European Parliament on a very important topic, which is the health of bees. And we are producing a guidance document, how to assess pesticides with their effects on bees, the bee guidance document, where we need the input of the risk managers to set the specific protection goals, but also discussion groups, focus group, bee partnerships, together with the European Parliament, to give this an as broad as possible legitimacy as possible. So I think it's really important to not only at the end of the process, but right from the beginning to include the civil society as much as possible. So also a big thank you to the European Parliament for this collaboration.
So perhaps the next conference is Society, Science and Policy, but just a thought. Pika.
I would just echo the same point, that I think it's really important that the participation is early and in the time of the process, that it makes sense, because this adds also to the trust and to the understanding of both the scientific process and also what the agencies are doing and the whole process actually. So I would say it's about not too late, not at the end.
Okay. So there's a couple of questions that's in there. So what is the role of national research institutions and regulatory authorities in bridging EU research to policy? Anybody like to peek?
I could start on that with the example of One Health EJP, where we have partner institutes in different countries across Europe, and I think that there are like funding enabling, making it possible for the national research institutes to work together on these topics and across the silos also. So these kind of initiatives really help to link this, and then it can be that there is the EU policies and agencies' role is part of that, but this is where the science happens and where it's linked to at the country level also.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Catherine and then Wim.
Thanks. Yeah, I would point to two things. Firstly, I think by participating in EU research, national authorities, who often themselves have research bodies attached, so they're very close, there's a real opportunity for exchange of knowledge and capacity building. We do see significant variation across the EU member states in terms of where they are, and I think that capacity building is really important. And then I would also say, you know, we see this distinction between the national policies and the EU policy process, but ultimately the co-decision process involves MEPs from the national level and the council, which represents the member states. So if we see that at national level, new concepts and ideas are absorbed by the national policymakers, they will then hopefully reflect that position and understanding when they take a stance in the council at EU level on policy developments. So it's all interlinked.
Thank you. Wim.
Yeah, continuing on that, I think it's essential. I think it would be totally wrong in understanding our discussion on research as the, how would I say, arrogant EU agency or perspective. I think this is absolutely not the case. I think, Catherine, you said a very nice word earlier, this hubris, you know, all of a sudden you think you have an overview and you know it all. No, I think a good example currently is the Strategic Research Innovation Action Plan and in support of the chemical, the CSS, the Strategy for Sustainability, where DG RTD is actually really going all the way, involving agencies, but also doing a lot of consultations and actually targeting the national research program. So it's totally complementary, and it should actually be a full synergy. I think it's happening, and luckily it's a good example that's on the way.
Thank you. We have a question from Dario Pizzelli, which links back to discussions yesterday. So it would be interesting to connect this debate on collaboration with a specific issue of how we move from traditional risk assessments to more integrated sustainability assessments. Are the different agencies, in terms of institutional culture, expertise, resources, self-perceived role, and the science policy interface, ready for this shift? That's a great question. To which the answer is hopefully yes. But does anybody want to? Yeah, who's going to go first? Anybody?
Well, I'm sorry, I'm going to talk about chemicals, but yeah, I mean, that's probably biased. You all probably have heard about safe and sustainable by design. I mean, until a couple of years, we were all at least concerned about the safety of chemicals. And definitely there is an opening window now to integrate life cycle assessment, also a science as old, I would say, as risk assessment, but not really fully incorporated in, at least not in a regulatory scheme. At least the foundations are there now. Are we ready for this shift? I think we have to be, but it again will be linked to a mandate, because, well, whether we like it or not, our mandate usually in a legislation determines our budget, and the budget determines, I mean, the resources. So there, in terms of preparedness, we are on the way to prepare, but it is definitely, I mean, it's an obligation, but it's linked to the mandate. I have to strengthen that.
Yeah. Bernhard.
Yeah, thank you. From a bit of a different perspective, I question that, and it was also mentioned yesterday, the dichotomy to say, will it be risk assessment or will it be sustainability assessment? I think it's the same thing, basically, because what we do in risk assessment is we look at a hazard, and then we look at exposure, and then we try to predict whether this will still meet a specific protection goal. Will the society, the consumer, be protected enough? That's what's called risk assessment. And you could do exactly the same with sustainability assessments. It's just different protection goals. It's a biodiversity protection goal. It might even be economic protection goals, social protection goals. So as soon as policymakers have defined protection goals, which will be a difficult task because of all the trade-offs, then we can do risk assessment for sustainability. It's the risk of not meeting a protection goal. So conceptually, for me, it's the same thing. It's just much broader, because it's not only about health risks, it's about social risks, it's about environmental risks, or translated into protection goals. So are we ready for that? I think methodological-wise we are ready, but we have limited mandates. So EFSA will not be able to do sustainability assessments, but we can contribute with our knowledge Lego bricks, together with others, to stitch it together, integrate it into a more holistic view on sustainability. So I think we are ready, but we need to work together on a complete different level.
Zoe.
I think that's really a disruption.
Okay. Zoe, you had a comment to make on this.
Just to follow on from that, from a European Parliament perspective, you know, we see EFSA and ECA assess individual chemicals in their risk assessment. But what we would really like to see is sort of long-term studies on a sort of population-wide basis as to sort of the cumulative and cocktail effects of these substances, you know, because they're assessed as sort of very small residual amounts on your food, but what does consumption of the various foods with the different cocktail effects of these chemicals? So I think that question certainly does need to be looked at in a lot more detail. And then there was also an interesting case from the European Court of Justice recently who recommended that certainly co-formulants in pesticides need to be looked at. So it certainly looks like there'll be a lot of work ahead for the agencies.
If I might, no, so Catherine.
Thank you, Mike. So just to pick up on those 2 points, at EA we do sustainability assessments, and we're currently working on an assessment for a baseline against the Zero Pollution Action Plan, where we will be including information on human population level exposure to chemicals and estimating health impacts. So we're starting to do that work, and indeed next year we'll be looking at the health impacts of pesticides. Of course, I think, if you look at the rigor, the scientific rigor that goes into a risk assessment for a single substance, you're never going to be able to replicate that level of rigor if you're doing a sustainability assessment. So you have to compromise on the types of evidence that you pull together. But we will try and tackle those assessments, and we're really happy to work with you on that production. If I just flag one more thing, that is that under the chemical strategy for sustainability, DG Environment has asked ECHA and EEA to work together to come up with a framework of indicators to assess progress towards those targets. And we are working collaboratively on that. We also have input from ECHA and from EMA. So that's a real cross-agency approach to trying to assess progress against what I think is a pretty progressive policy agenda.
I agree with everything that's been said. Just to put another spin on it, I think one of the issues here is about time frame. That quite often risk assessments are quite here and now and reactive. And for me, sustainability assessments are taking a longer term view. And so in response to the question, Dario's question, I see that more and more of the EU agencies are investing in foresight or futures work. And I think that is part of the culture that will support that shift towards perhaps a more proactive and sustainability-focused effort. But we have to continue investing in that. And at the moment, a lot of agencies are at the stage of doing the foresight work, but then the next stage is then to translate and say, okay, well, we invest our resources into what might be called sustainability assessments on the basis of that. So I think it's actually part of this for me, and it is just a particular theme for me, is about getting that balance right between reactive and proactive. And often the pressures are put on agencies in terms of the barrage of requests for this, that, and the other. It's quite difficult sometimes to get one's head above the reactive parapet. So, I like a question to start, imagine. Imagine that there would be a cross-cluster 1 and 6 One Health partnership. What would be the added value for the agencies? At this time, I'm not quite sure what the 1 and 6 is, but sorry, Catherine?
I mean, we already have the partnership on One Health, so would this be an extension of that? Is that the proposal?
I mean, there is actually the One Health European Joint Program, so there is no continuation of that, and these two are the next lines. So the cluster 1 is health, and cluster 6 is then more the animal side and environment, so they go to do different things, and there are some links between those call texts, but there is no cross-cluster one opportunity to work together. And from our side, this is kind of a worry, and we would like to voice this and maybe bring forward that after this One Health EJP that seems to be really impactful and successful and nice example, and then we feel like we are kind of, again, scattered around, and it's difficult to keep that collaboration. And I think this is a good question, because also we have been then bringing that One Health research and research done with the One Health approach. We have been offering on a plate that to the different stakeholders across, so now that when it goes then again more in a way silos.
It's a bit, just to be provocative,
yeah.
It seems a bit disappointing that One Health in that context is a set of parallel silos going forward,
yeah,
rather than the genuine integration. But I may have misunderstood that. And
no, I think that is correct. And I mean, there are some things, One Health is mentioned, and for some aspects there is more focus on that. But basically these clusters are putting a new barrier or making it more challenging to
well, at least
gather.
in things like GIAC report, we're actually trying to glue the different things together and say what it means across the different domains. Catherine, you look like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, we haven't got much time left, but I mean, I think EEA is on the advisory board of the One Health Partnership, and we really appreciate that interaction. And we discussed it, and until we came, the environmental dimension was a little overlooked, right? It was sort of lesser to the human health than the veterinary health dimensions and the infectious disease dimensions. And I think for us as an agency, you know, just a very simple example, we're making all these recommendations about access to green space in cities, and we have the urban renovation, the ecosystem renovation under the nature restoration law. And we talked about this in the lunch break, right, or the coffee break. You know, if we bring green spaces into our cities, we know there's benefits for human health, but we also, in some areas, have the potential to bring in disease vectors, you know, mosquitoes or ticks, and there's also issues around allergies and pollens. So I think for us, you know, if we're making those kinds of recommendations, understanding always the linkages to human health aspects and disease linkages would help us to make our recommendations more targeted and ultimately more effective.
Okay, Bernhard.
Yeah, thank you. Building on that, on both of you, I think it shows the challenge we have to bring development work, research, which is time limited, it's projectized, it has an end, into the business as usual, as we call it, of advising policy decisions. The one thing is research. It's time limited, it's done, new project comes, but what we need is an ongoing basis, scientific advice to policymakers. And this is exactly the theme of this session. How can we make this interface more fluid that even if, may I say it, if the project goes to an end, the outcomes will not be lost because they are translated into what we would call a process mode of producing scientific advice. And this interface is not yet working properly, I think, at least from my perspective. We lose something. You produce so much, and we take up only maybe 20%. And there we have to work we have to invent something like a structure that takes that over and brings it into our business as usual scientific advice process.
Sure. I mean, I recognize that frustration absolutely. And to the frustration of everybody, I'm going to call this to a close because we've run out of time. So thank you very much to our panel members, and thank you very much to the audience for some great questions. So first of all, if I could ask you to thank our panel. And at this point, we allow our panel to take their seats in the audience. And I will be handing over to Steph Bronswarth, research coordinator at EFSA. And Steph has the enviable, or is it unenviable, task of pulling out the golden nuggets from all the discussions, all the things that have been said today. So Steph, over to you, and I must give my farewell because I have to dash. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mike, for moderating this very interactive, very pleasant, very constructive session. Indeed, a daunting task for me to try to make sense of it, as was often remembered. I will try to do so by walking through the main messages that I picked up from these discussions. Actually, I think there's a rich harvest to share, so I'll be succinct. I will not be able to memorate everything. First of all, maybe to thank Mike for the opening words to remind us that this session looked at the science policy interface. And in fact, reminding us that agencies, the different 5 agencies that we saw singing from the same songbook today, that we were created to support policy. However, Mike reminded us that there is room for improvement in that support, that we could do more. And that, I think, is what we investigated this morning, and I think we have some concrete suggestions there. Bernhard then opened by proposing that agencies are actually agents of change, which is needed in this changing world because we do need to transition. He remembered that the pandemic actually, with the viral agent jumping species, will require non-silo approaches across silos. He made a call for actionable evidence so that the outcomes of research projects, and he repeated that also later, can be used by regulatory science, by the agencies. He reminded, or he actually invited all of us to come to Berlin on the 7th of December for the RARA, the Risk Assessment Research Assembly, where we will deepen this discourse. And actually, I hope also there, and I'm sure also there, to have the involvement of the agencies. Finally, he made an invitation to the audience, which I think we've taken up on, to be honest, in order to define these One Health research needs, or the research needs from a One Health perspective, maybe better said. Could this be facilitated by establishing a One Health research platform, structure, governance? And I think the answer has been very wholeheartedly yes. I found it very encouraging to hear so much commitment from the different agencies, acknowledging that we need to put resources into that. Karen came then on stage to tell us about the outcomes of the high-level expert group report, which has just been published, and she invited us to read that report. And I think, as I understood, her main message is indeed we have done a lot, we are doing a lot. Europe is well equipped, actually, when it comes to research support, RTD, the agencies, the scientific advice mechanism. But actually, this high-level expert group was asked to explore the needs, the gaps, and also to provide options on strengthening this international science policy interface further for food systems transformation. So Karen will not yet retire because we're not there yet. Because this report clearly outlined that we need this transformation to be supported by more ambitious and more interlinked, more multidisciplinary science policy interfaces. We need multi-sectoral task forces, and we need network of networks. Then Robert van Gorcom quoted actually Eric Brenninkmeijer on the cooperation between agencies to need to reach another level. So far, synergies have been sought primarily by horizontal administrative processes, such as IT and HR, but policy coordination and cooperation is a more promising area. And I found this a quote worth in memory of Mr. Brenninkmeijer. Then Robert provided a few examples of the obvious complementarities between the agencies that our domains do touch. There are complementarity. And actually this exchange of knowledge is a necessity, and actually it's also win-win. He pleaded for a proper involvement in the programming of the EU framework RTD programs, especially because agencies bring in these regulatory science perspective. And finally, he also remembered that we need to be ready for the future because research engagement, research means also to build the future generation of scientists, which we need for risk assessment work, which we need for the panels in the different agencies. Then we had a very good discussion in the panel, which I note was a full female panel. Bravo, well done. With Zoe Dingwell, Catherine, and Pika. Remembering us that we, in fact, face very complex issues that require multi-sectoral cooperation. But the panel went also into what are the barriers that we face. So, for example, we faced the issue of different mandates of the agencies, which will require that we need time to understand each other, to know of each other what we are doing. So that means also an investment of resources to reach out to each other. The issue of silo regulation, which is still a matter of fact, which will require also from the risk manager's side a proper One Health perspective. And it was encouraging actually at the opening lecture of this conference to hear that Sante will set up this One Health AMR directorate soon. Another barrier that was mentioned is that obviously agencies are busy. The staff in the agencies are basically fully loaded with the workload that is agreed in their work programs, and that also makes for a lack of time and brain power to think of what we need for the future. And there probably we need to do better to sit together and take time to step away from the daily business, and to do this also from a One Health perspective. Apart from these barriers that were mentioned, it was acknowledged, and I agree, maybe we actually also do a good job. And actually, in a good example maybe is the One Health EGP. that have delivered really a lot of practical tools and methodologies ready for use. Other issues that were mentioned, but I'll skip a bit here, is a sense of urgency. We can't wait, and we know that it's in all the different talks in this conference. It requires One Health, I like that quote, is a way of living. It requires a mentality change. Especially when you speak to youngsters, you get that sense. And there, in fact, was an interesting remark, I think, from Catherine, that what we witnessed with COVID, that from one day to the other, we were able to change. But actually, the other threat, the more chronic threat, is not less. And are we ready to make that change? And we, meaning agencies, we, meaning audience, we, meaning all of us. The issue of timing was discussed, the difficulty of the agencies having different timelines, work plans, obviously, but also the policy processes having different timelines. And a strong plea was made that, in fact, we as science providers need to be ready to deliver when the discourse is ongoing, when the decision-making is ongoing. And that may require to step up speed sometimes. Then finally, I was very happy that also already in this debate there were quite a good number of hints for solutions. For example, agencies are already involved in the advisory boards, or the EGP, the One Health EGP was mentioned, the PARC was mentioned. And in fact, it's our job to build these bridges to policymakers. We're set up to do so. But the same we need to do with the research projects. And that, of course, was reminded, takes resources. As an interesting invitation I noted from Zoe that the MV agencies actually should be involved also in the Council Parliament negotiations to guarantee the One Health approach. And I will not lose this note. And then a very concrete suggestion was made to set up a task force, maybe an interagency task force, One Health task force, to discern what we need, who does what from the different agencies, and actually maybe make a joint statement from there to be ready also for the new commission, for example. That I think is a very practical, actionable action that hopefully we'll follow up on after this conference. I'm sure we will. Then after the break, we had a good case study I found from DMR, bringing a good number of reports where we already do the interagency cooperation. And I like the final suggestion that for the alignment of the funding cycle and the partnership, we need to align between the research funding bodies, the risk assessors, the risk managers. And that is actually already in practice with AMR, but certainly can improve also in other domains. Then a very rich final discussion, but I'll skip here a lot because we're running really out of time. We spoke about the anticipation, so how can we anticipate the research needs better, but we recalled also the blue skies, the need for blue sky research. If we face a gap in implementation science, how can we overcome fragmentation? And there again, the plea for a supra-agency platform or community to bring it all together from the One Health perspective. Importantly, we remembered that we need to be ready also for future crises. So that means investing also during peacetime to be ready and work together. How to bring into the civil society, not only at the end of the process, but also in the beginning and maybe even during the process as we try. An example was the B guidance document. Role of national agencies, how to go from risk assessment, proper traditional to sustainable assessments. Maybe it's not so far apart. And finally, the One Health partnership, if we lose out there and because it comes from different clusters. So that would be my wrap-up for today. I think we had a very interesting, good session. I thank you for your participation. As said, I would like to thank Mike for the moderation. I'd like to thank Clem also for the preparation, and a lot of EFSA colleagues behind the scenes to make today's session possible, but obviously the whole conference. I'd like to thank also Bernhard. It's not in my script, but I think he has a visionary approach, and it was very nice actually to witness the concordance with the other agencies today. I think that sets a good base for the future. We'll leave you now. There is opportunity, especially for the folks online, to meet some of the contributors just now after the session, immediately. I think Karen Fabbri is available, and Pika, I believe, is available. So it's also an opportunity for those not physically here to meet with them virtually. Obviously, you're invited to go for lunch as yesterday, and there I would like to mention that in the Grand Hall, we spoke about the future generation, there is young colleagues actually at 12:45, so 1:45 after you've had good time for lunch. We're already at 34. They will actually organize a science cafe about the omics methods and their future potential in regulatory science. So thank you all, and see you in the next session. Bye.